Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, of course, on whose lands the University of Sydney's campus lies. And I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal people who are here with us tonight. And further, I want to acknowledge the tremendous work that's been done over many years by Aboriginal people in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing, and with the release of the Closing the Gaps, the government's response to the Closing the Gap report just a couple of days ago. I think it was very disappointing to see the level of reportage and the level of virtually no progress on all of the indicators. The 3 indicators reported in that report and the government's response. Turning to this evening, just let me say a little bit about the Henry Halloran Research Trust, which is hosting tonight's lecture. We run a series of events throughout the year. Many of you, I know, have engaged with them. The Henry Halloran Research Trust is a cross-disciplinary centre, which means we draw on all of the bodies of knowledge across our University of Sydney and other universities to look at problems associated with cities and regions, and of course housing is central to that. And we do that by funding research and by supporting research and evidence-informed dialogue between scholars, but also between industry leaders, community leaders, advocates and professionals. And so I extend a really warm welcome to all of you in the room, because I know many of you are wearing at least one of those hats, if not more. So tonight I'm very delighted to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Richard Ronald from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Of course, we often think of the Netherlands as a kind of housing utopia, and certainly we can, we've got people like Professor Vivian Milligan in the room, whose research has shown us actually that Australia would be slightly more utopian in the housing space if we were able to take a leaf from the Netherlands. But it's important to really understand another housing system before we can learn from it properly, and to think through the lessons that we might be able to apply for better or for worse in understanding and in starting to address the depth of Australia's current housing crisis. So Professor Richard Ronald holds the role of housing and is Professor of Housing and Chair of Political and Economic Geographies at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on housing in relation to social, economic and urban transformations, not only in the Netherlands but across Europe and the Asia Pacific. He's well known for his research and writing across the housing studies world, and he was formerly editor-in-chief of one of our preeminent, if not the preeminent, international journal of housing policy. He's held positions in universities around the world, and so he can offer insights from that truly global perspective. His most recent book is titled Families, Housing and Property Wealth in a Neoliberal World. Professor Ronald's going to talk particularly, but not only, about the private rental sector in the Netherlands, and of course in Australia, as in the Netherlands, the private rental sector has become such a critical segment of the housing system. But in the Netherlands, it's become so from a very different starting point. Professor Ronald's going to talk to us for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion with the audience. And then at 6, we will invite you to join us outside to continue the conversation. So please do stay for that. And with that, thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you. So first of all, just to check I'm audible. I've got a very loud voice anyway, my wife tells me. And I'd like to thank first of all, thank you, Nicole, for inviting me and having this opportunity to speak to you all today. And begin with a disclaimer, I'm going to be talking about the Netherlands, but you may have guessed from the accent that I'm originally from the UK, In fact, I noticed we're in Darlington, and I spent the first 18 years of my life trying to leave Darlington, so I'm back again. I've been in the Netherlands for 18 years. I recently became a citizen, thank you, Brexit. And it's a longer journey, and I actually started off in Japan after Darlington. And I've worked on doing housing research in Japan and South Korea, little bits on China. So it's kind of a broad-scale range of research I do in different housing sectors. But I've been at Amsterdam for several years, and I'm going to try and tell, there's two places in this title, I'm going to try and tell kind of two stories. So I want to tell the story of Dutch housing for kind of, in a way that Australians can kind of engage with. To understand it's a country very close to the UK, it's a centre-right government, although we might be moving away to something a bit more extreme right shortly. It's slightly wealthier than the UK in terms of GDP per capita. But there's a very different set of norms about housing and what's appropriate, also about inequality for that matter as well, and taxation. My three key images here, and what you might all think about when you think about Australia, the Netherlands, and they're all Amsterdam, by the way, are kind of these different periods in its housing history. The top one, please go to this place if you come, is Het Schip. It's the Housing and Social Housing Museum in Amsterdam. It was built at the beginning of the 20th century, and very much typical of the expansion of social housing at that time, kind of the foundations of that. The middle picture is the Balmer Estates, built in the 60s and finished in the 70s, which is one of the biggest social housing estates in Europe at the time. Not necessarily considered a great success, but continued investment goes into it rather than abandoning it. And now it looks quite different to this. And it's still concentrated with social housing, but it's still kind of a relatively nice place to live. And lastly, we have the Pontstijgers here on the rivers of the banks of the Amstel, quite near the centre. This is not social housing. This is kind of part of that wave of the neoliberal shift, I would argue, that we've had over the last 20 years that has allowed this kind of extreme building housing for the extremely wealthy. So the top apartment here was sold to a housing developer, actually, based in the Netherlands for several million. So this kind of not social housing. Great views, though. But it still combines in Amsterdam. We're still building social housing, and in kind of combination with a more market approach. I don't want to get ahead of myself, though. So I'm going to kind of start my story. Of course, you want the history, when time began. I also start with a bit of geography, of course. I made this the other day. I thought it's very useful to people to appreciate where we live. So the Netherlands, it's a small place, but 18 million. And of that 18 million, about 10 of them live on the left-hand side. So if I drive in a straight line for more than an hour and a half, I am no longer in the Netherlands. We have very kind of, and also, most of this country is below sea level. And what you have on this left side is a kind of set of dunes, and behind that wetlands that has been basically pumped dry. And that's where we live. Amsterdam is a very large swamp, and about 11 meters under the ground is a layer of sand. That's the most solid thing we have, and so everything is built on poles that go down to that level. So it's a very constrained physical space, and most of the economic activity is in what's called the Randstad, which is this a laser? Yeah, here we go. So Amsterdam's about here, Utrecht's here, Rotterdam's here, The Hague is here. So we have this circle, the rim city, where most of the population live. So we have to have a very controlled planning system because of that, which we'll get to. There we go. Hey! So the Dutch words you will learn today, you will learn certainly woningcorporatie. So that's a housing association. So what's very specific to think about how we developed our very large social housing sector. So I said, actually, can I go back on this? There we go. I said, yeah, we have we're famous for this social housing sector. We have, at the moment, about 29–30% of housing in the Netherlands is social rental housing. In the big cities, it's about 40%. If you've gone back to 1995, for Amsterdam, it's about 58%. And on top of that is a large controlled rental sector, which I'll get into in detail a bit later. But basically, if you're in 1995 in Amsterdam, about 65–66% of the housing is social or rent-controlled housing. And this is not, I mean, it is a left-wing city, but it's a wealthy city. Higher GDP per capita than Sydney, yet we have all this social housing. We survive. Capitalism continues. So there are lessons if you want to take away. This very large supply of social housing kind of lies with the housing corporations that were established at the beginning of the 20th century. So the Woningwet is the housing law that was pushed through, again, not by left-wing politics, by political liberals, with a view, and here's a recurring story for this whole talk, in fact, that if you leave it to the markets, there's not enough housing supply, prices go up. So then we have to intervene. So this is kind of the first major intervention in Dutch housing. And what it really did with the Woningwet was it made local authorities responsible for housing quality, but also provided a framework where they would help finance any association, kind of a coming together of people, with the intent of providing housing with a social objective. So what this really means is that people could get together, go and apply and get finance, supported by the local authority, to build housing. So they're kind of entrepreneurial, they're doing it themselves. It's people like the tram drivers union, the school teachers union, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, the Reformed Protestant Church. These are kind of the pillars of Dutch society that were essentially competing against each other for clients. So a lot of organizations came together, formed a society, built some housing. And we have this massive explosion at the beginning of the 20th century of small housing associations. So I've said here they're private association with clients. So it's not some obscure organization top down above you. You are a part of this organization if you're a housing association. And they serve you as a client. There's 112 housing associations in 1889. And by the 1920s, there's 1,300. And like this is about 10% of the housing or more at the time in 1920. So a huge explosion in these societies that really established in the major cities a kind of ring of social housing. That when you go to Dutch cities these days, you start in the centre, you'll probably be in some old, maybe even medieval centre. And as you move out and you will enter some kind of early 20th century social housing path at some point. And it looks like this. Okay. There we go. In the 1930s, the housing crisis, if you like, the housing supply problem was essentially considered over. That housing corporations had fulfilled their role, that they provided the housing that was needed mostly for the industrial working classes. And so attention was turned away from them. Legislation shifted. At this point, I'd also say the first municipal housing authorities came into place. So there's not council housing like you get in the UK. There was some local authority housing. And this was very much more for the very poor or the very poorly housed. Because housing association housing, for the school teachers union, for example, they were kind of a privileged working class. So this kind of housing wasn't for the very, very poor. It was for kind of regular working people. But in the 30s, it began to phase out. And of course, with the 1940s, nothing much was built. There was a big war on. A lot of houses were damaged during the war. That meant that in 1945 and the years after, there's huge housing supplies. And of course, everybody got very sexy and produced lots of babies. So there's a kind of a baby boom as well, and there's real pressures on the housing market. So this is kind of chapter 2 in my story, if you like. There is a new set of interventions by the state on a grand scale. That the state is seen as being very capable of kind of rebuilding the country. It's going through that process anyway. So we have coordinated mass home building and urban expansion in the cities as well. And the way the state achieves this is by basically co-opting, for need of a better word, the housing associations that existed. They existed as an infrastructure already, who were capable of building housing, and they were given the task of producing hundreds of thousands of units over the coming decades. So a lot of subsidies, basically money from the state to builders to build social housing was stimulated. Became about 12% of the government budget by the late 70s. So a lot of money is put in. But I'd also emphasize again, there is left-wing government at this time, but it's not seen as a left-wing project. It is seen that it's a tender-neutral project, that the state sponsors and subsidizes lots of different kinds of housing intervention. So what we also have in the Netherlands is mortgage interest tax relief. So I pay for my mortgage interest, and as a middle-class member of homeowner society, I get my money back. I get my subsidy. So every month, the government works out how much tax I've paid, and then how much interest I've paid, and gives me money back. So usually everybody gets several hundred euros every month. This goes back to the post-war period. So middle-class home buyers get a subsidy. The social housing sector gets a subsidy. I guess I should move from a picture. So this is kind of, the classic European modernist, internationalist architecture, flat roofs. Maybe they should have spent a bit more on this housing. Again, as you walk through the cities of the Netherlands, you'll reach this band of housing. A lot of it still is social housing. But by the 1980s, we see beginnings of shift. This is the Pentagon. It's in the middle of Amsterdam. This was kind of an area of urban renewal that was cleared in the early 1980s and built. I'd say at this point there is kind of more political emphasis or impetus behind the social housing movement. But at the same time, because of this 12%, the governments of any colour were interested in moving away from social housing provision. So I'm sure that Vivian might correct me at some point because she's the expert on this kind of period more than me. And I said I'm going to talk about private renting. I've talked about social renting so far. And really the story of the housing system, another way of framing it, is about the decline of private renting. So the UK is also a story where 15, 20% of housing was unoccupied at the beginning of the century, and the rest was pretty much private rental. And by the end of the century, that had reversed. And in the Netherlands, too, what we see is this massive decline of the private rental sector, replaced by, at first, social housing, and then later on this shift towards home ownership. So massive house building again in the 60s and 70s. Hundreds of thousands of units are built added to the housing stock. So if you are somebody born in the 30s or 40s, as you would form a family in the 50s and 60s, especially if you live in a city, you would normally move into social housing, and you may move out again later on. But for that generation at least, it was very normal to have at some point in your life lived in social housing, which might be one of the reasons why people aren't so prejudiced against it. Private renting, and this is where we get into all these different details about how housing systems work. Private renting is not like you know it. So private renting, due to housing shortages, etc., in the 50s and 60s, is split into two. It's not split, but basically rules are introduced, regulations are introduced by which housing that's judged to be of poor quality or suitable to low-income households is put into the social sector. What do I mean by that? Yeah, there's a point system. So the government institutes a point system, local authorities are in charge of administering it, and so if you move into an apartment, and it still applies, you think, I'm paying too much rent for the quality of this place, I ring up the local authority, they would send somebody around, they'd measure the place, they look at the quality of the amenities, the outside spaces, etc. And if a property gets less than 142 points, my rent is controlled. Basically, my house falls into the same rules as social housing in terms of quality, in terms of prices. So the maximum rents that apply to social housing units are applied to those private rental units. So landlords from this period onwards are, unless they've got something quite luxurious, are mostly renting out within that sector. And in fact, up until the 1990s, as a private landlord, you'd be allocated with tenants. You wouldn't advertise in kind of privately to recruit people. You'd be allocated with people from the social housing list. So essentially, that large part of the private rental sector is an extension of the social housing sector. But we'll get rid of this sooner or later. So by 2000, I put this extra factor in to kind of give you a sense of how big that sector is. Because it shrunk very recently. By 2000, more than 70% of the private rental stock is subject to the point system, and the maximum rent for that in Amsterdam today is about 750 euros. So I know these kinds of things are a bit nuanced. I'm prepared to take questions. Per month. Sorry? Per month. Per month. Oh yeah, you're Australians. For some reason, it's every 2 weeks or weekly? What? Do you move in and out that quickly? Okay. So this is, all my rents are going to be monthly. How am I doing? Oh. Okay, so we get towards the 1990s. Hey, things are going well again. There was a big housing crash in the early 80s. The government responded by getting the housing associations again to build more houses to get them out of that crisis. So, for example, in Amsterdam, about 80–90% of housing built in the 80s was actually social housing companies building social housing. There's a feeling again towards the end of the 90s, it's time to get that market back in. So there's a restructuring goes on. I'm going to go through these a bit quicker because I want to get to the new stuff. But essentially, the shift now is towards home ownership. So Mensa Vensa Vona, which is people desires housing, which is like 10 years later from the HERMA report, essentially sets out a plan to reorientate the housing system around the market, but around people being able to buy their own homes. So how do we achieve this? Well, what's the big problem? Well, we have this huge social sector, which in the 1980s is about 40% of the housing. So it's about dismantling the sector. So this process started earlier, actually, in the 1970s, but rents were increased in the social sector, and a housing subsidy scheme, housing allowance, was introduced. So this allowed housing associations to charge higher rents, but if tenants had a lower salary, they could get the rental subsidy. So housing associations could generate more money, rents became more aligned with regular markets, yet there was still less inequality because of the rent subsidies. I've called it a very peculiar privatization. So over that period, up until 95, housing associations were basically being prepared for being cut loose from the state. That they would all go back to their status as private organizations and would function legally as non-profit organizations. And there was more than 1,000 of them in 1990. Basically, their debts were wiped away and they were given the assets of the land and the properties they had. I won't go into this too much, but yeah, there's a financial element to this that organizations created. The Central Funds Volkshuis Vesting was basically a central organization that would support all the housing associations. They'd all pay in, and it became a reserve, but it also would provide a guarantee along with the VSV if housing associations want to borrow money in the private market. So housing associations could actually borrow money more cheaply in order to build social housings. And we also had this idea of a revolving fund, that housing associations from 1995 onwards would finance themselves by building lots of new built housing, but also selling it off. So they build housing for the market, for homeowners to buy, if you like, and that would cross-subsidize social units in the same buildings. I put here last part, in the 90s and 2000s, there was lots of mergers, millions, and mismanagement. So house prices went up significantly in the late 90s, early 2000s. Housing associations became particularly wealthy because of this. There was lots of mergers. They became more business-orientated, encouraged by the state. They started paying their directors too much money. A few scandals hit the news. You know, one director was being driven around in a Maserati with a chauffeur and being paid more than the Prime Minister, but they were a non-government, non-profit organization. Another housing association in Rotterdam bought a ship, a cruise ship, to be converted to some kind of, had these social duties. They wanted to create some kind of center on this ship where people could go to do job training, do other kind of community kind of activities. And they bought it for 9 million, and they were going to convert it, but they spent 200 million getting the asbestos out of it. And the biggest probably scandal was Vestia. So Vestia, before the global financial crisis, was a very large housing association, 400,000 plus units, had lots of cash, and so wanted to put it somewhere. So they basically bet it on derivatives, bet it on interest rates going up, and they went down. They lost 2 billion. So they got saved by the Save AF. But basically, there was a lot of discrediting of housing associations at this time. And then come in these two characters. So this is Mark Rutte, who's still the Prime Minister, but he's been since 2010. Longest running Prime Minister in Europe. He's about to step down because his party lost. And next to him is Stefan Bloch. I was going to say he's the housing minister, but he's the opposite of that. So one of the first things they did was dismantle the housing ministry and absorb it into the Ministry of Finance. And they set up a number of measures, and they very much saw the social housing sector as the problem. So lots of measures to get rid of it. So first of all, they reduced kind of the objectives of housing associations. So new lettings should only be to people should be means-tested, only lower income within particular criteria should be allocated to social housing. They introduced a tax called the landlord levy on large housing rental companies, i.e. housing corporations, about 2 billion a year to kind of cross-subsidize the activities they were involved with, but basically helped suppress the building of social housing. Very importantly for the housing point system, they introduced the VOZ to the calculation of the points. VOZ. Basically, the local authority, based on sales in your neighborhood, values your house for you every year, and you pay your city tax based on that valuation. What they introduced in 2013-14 was, in the point system from now on, to include the market value of your neighborhood in the calculation. The VOZ value was the WOZ value, sorry, was included in the points calculation. So from that point, when people left a house that was in a protected sector, it would be reassessed. And if you're in somewhere like Amsterdam where house prices went up a lot, it would fall out of that sector. And I'll show you the impact shortly. And also important was they got rid of secure tenures, secure tenancies. So if you were a tenant in Amsterdam before 2016, you basically had security of tenure for life, and there's controls on how much rent can be increased for sitting tenants. And the government said, no, we can scrap that, and there'll be 2-year contracts are possible. So this was a way basically to make the private rental sector much more attractive to both developers and, so it turned out, landlords. So that's been the problem for recent years. So this is kind of the second half of the story, is this shift we've had towards landlord investment, buy-to-let investors, in all these gaps that were created by this Margaret government in the last 10, 12, 14 years even. And I'll focus more on Amsterdam because Amsterdam is kind of the extreme case. It's moved from being kind of a port city, a working class city, to being a financial hub in Europe. So there's a lot of kind of more middle class jobs being created there, a lot more pressure on the housing market. But also it was this place where it had more social housing than anywhere else. I always like this graph. This is house prices in Amsterdam going back to 1620. Data unavailable, I assume, in these parts. But you see how extraordinary house price increases have been in the recent decades. So this goes up to 2000, the global financial crisis, somewhere around here. And this is what's happened since the global financial crisis. So this is house prices in the Netherlands versus Europe. This is Amsterdam versus the rest of the country. So you see, our house prices, we used to compare ourselves with Rotterdam. And now Amsterdam is way out in the lead. And this is kind of the overview, the most, well, could be more up to date. But it's around here still. Of course, we've had interest rate increases, which suppress growth. But the last 12 months, we still had 2% increase in house prices in the Netherlands. So there's been intense pressure on the Amsterdam market, particularly amongst, we've had population growth, amongst other things. 20% population growth in the last 15 years. A lot of new jobs after the crisis were created in Amsterdam, particularly kind of middle class, financial sector jobs, service sector, and also a growth in the kind of training institutions like the place I work at the university, amongst other universities there. What happened to social housing? Well, there's been a decline in output. There's been sales of social housing. I'm going to flick through these because I've got a lot of them. Decline in social allocations over the kind of the 2010s. Basically, a kind of the policies to encourage disengagement from the social housing providers effectively worked. So we have a lot of social housing in Amsterdam still. Hang on, there it is. But it's very hard to get hold of, I'll get into. So it's a 13-year waiting list if you want to sit and wait on the list to get into a social housing unit. And it's quite hard to get into a rent-controlled private one too. So if you want to live in Amsterdam and you're middle income, pressure to buy. Thus, I'd argue the prices. I think what's worth looking at here is that actually you see the growth in home ownership. In 1995, it was 11% home ownership. In 1980, it was 6% home ownership in Amsterdam. So you can see how fast it grew, but then tapered away. And arguably the reason lies here. So this is housing association housing, so it's 55% here. Gone down quite fast, because less building and selling off. Also, part of it is actually rented out in the private rental market now, the best parts of it. But here we have this shift. So the private rental sector was about 24%, down to 22%, and back up to 30% in a bit again. But more importantly, the rent-regulated part used to be about 20% of the housing, and the liberalized was about 4%, and now it's 11 to 19. So really, we've had this massive growth in the private rental sector. A lot of new build has been private rental. And this is evidence of the landlords descending. So this is the 4 biggest cities and the different kinds of buyers. And basically, yeah, very simply, we see from here this kind of investor landlords entering in, and then an explosion, and then after 16, it goes woof. And I threw these in. I'm sorry, there's too many graphs, but I kept them simple. There's no regressions. But you see, yeah, so overall, the rental sector grew nationally from 12% to 14%, but in Amsterdam, it's a much more significant growth, and I think this tells the story a bit better. So you see the private rental versus the housing association builds. And this is basically permits for building new ones. So we have this, yeah, a relatively small growth if you look nationally, but of the total housing stock of an extra 646,000 units, about 250,000 are new build private ones. So the source of new build, and it's especially big in the cities. So what the drivers of the private rental growth sector are, firstly, is new build. Secondly, is conversion of unoccupied units. So all the people who became homeowners, or those units that were private rental, became unoccupied, a lot of them, the smaller ones in particular, have been bought back and pulled back into the private rental sector now that landlords have kind of more freedom to charge rents, and also in a context where prices are going up a lot. And the last one, yeah, this churn of stocks at the point system. So a lot of those rent-controlled units are no longer rent-controlled. But there's going to be a good ending, by the way. This is just to give you an idea of how the rental tenure structure changed. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much, but basically you see how much the regulated declined and the liberalised sector grew. And I've done lots of work on millennials and young adults in the Amsterdam housing sector. And we have lots of data in the Netherlands to look at this. And what you see is, if you go back for the dates, here we go. So in Amsterdam, of people in this age range, it used to be mostly low-income people. And this has changed over time with the restructuring of the housing sector. And now actually it's mostly higher-income people make up that sector. So it's not necessarily people who are being displaced, but to be able to move into the Amsterdam housing market, you need to be quite well heeled. And it's not that young people are moving in and buying. They can't afford to do that. The generation before did that. This generation is very much the ones. Where is this? Is it working? No, I haven't broken it. This is younger people, and this is the 10 years of living. So you see that they very much, they've really filled up the rent-regulated sector of housing. So overall, or especially for older people, a little bit of change, but not much. But this generation, back in 2005, if you were 25, you were much more likely to live in a rent-regulated unit, and now you're much more likely to live in a rent-liberalised unit. The last thing to say before I turn a bit more to kind of what's happened recently is, or maybe I'm talking about that already, is we've had a big growth in co-living building. So this is commercial co-living. So this is private developers that build very small studio units. I'm sure you have a lot of these. And we've had a big boom of this in Europe. London, as you can see, is the biggest sector for it. This is a JLL. So it's a private real estate research company. I compiled this. But Amsterdam, considering we're a tenth the size of London, we have this huge supply. And the reason is that the city owns 80% of the land. So the deals with historically, the city made deals with housing associations to build what the city thought was needed. Ooh, didn't do that. And one of the things they think is needed to solve the housing supply problem and the housing price problem is build little units, little boxes. So this is a place called Our Domain, built next to a metro station on the edge of the city. More than 1,000 units, mostly rented out to people aged 20 to 35. Quite high rents, actually, for a little box. It's a presentation for another day. I could talk about this a lot. This is 21, and this is 1972. So this is, in the 70s, people protesting against increasing social rents, and a different kind of demographic profile in the protesters here. And this is the ones from 2021, a series of protests about the housing crisis, the inability of young people to pay or find cheaper housing. I've got 5 minutes? I've got 5 minutes. Good. So over the last 3 or 4 years, housing, there's been a growing awareness that housing is a key problem, and that people, well-off middle-class parents have realized that their children, as they enter adulthood, are entering a different universe to them. So there's been considerable political pressure, but also a considerable response. So they haven't reinstated the housing ministry. We have a housing minister, and this is Mr. de Jong from the Christian Democratic Appeal Party. And he was assigned, he was the health minister during COVID, so he solves crises. And he's been assigned now housing to solve. And they didn't like what he came up with, to be honest, but that's coalitions for you. So he's done a number of simple things that you might find quite radical. First of all, people buying, from 2021, people buying a second property, because they're assumed to be rented out. The purchase tax has gone from 2%, which is what you normally pay, to 8%. Since then, it's gone to 10.4%. People buying houses, new build houses, or social houses, social housing that's been sold off to owner-occupiers, there is a self-owned place, a requirement to occupy. So this is a city-level regulation that requires you to not rent a property you bought for 5 years. There's kind of rules around, you can rent out to family members perhaps if you move away. But the idea is that even private sector unoccupied new housing can only be bought on the condition that you will live in it. We have the Ubleton. Oh, I'm getting hands up. The Ubleton? Or the... Yeah. So a jubilant, Jubal, ton, 100,000. So it's a tax. So from the global financial crisis to stimulate property prices to grow again, the government removed tax on gifts you give to your children to buy housing. And actually that went up to 100,000 at one point as a response to the price of houses. Now, Australians all know the best thing to do if houses are too expensive, give people money and prices won't go up even more. It became very clear in the last few years that this extra 100,000 is just simply marketized. It just adds to the values of properties. So they've taken that away from this year. And they've taken away the landlord levy on social providers. And that was debated quite hotly. Like, why did we have this? Now we have a crisis. Why did we do this? Because it just suppressed social building. They've set out a plan to build 900,000 units. We build, so it's 18 million people, and we build about 65, 70,000 houses a year. And they want to increase that by about a third or by 50%. By lots of different things, but they're basically requiring each local authority to have a plan to increase their housing supply. And 30% of that should be social. That sounds quite a lot, but actually what it means is the slowing down of the decline of the sector, because that's less than what was. And the last thing, and this is my last little chapter, because I know I'm running out of time, but this is the crazy stuff, I think, for you guys. They're trying to create a new middle-income housing sector. So this is the Middelhuur Challenge, and they've extended the point system. And they've created basically a middle sector. So 142 points below is for low-income housing, regulated. If you go up to 187 points now, then you're in the middle segment, and there's a maximum rent for that too. It's a little bit higher. So that's about 1,100 euros a month. And this is quite controversial because a lot of landlords who came in the late 2010s will have their rents brought massively down and they can't afford it. So there's a lot of private landlords selling up right now. So it might be about 4.1% of units. There's lots of other incentives in here as well. So like if you renovate your house and increase the energy value, you get extra points. And also they soften the impact of the calculation of the value in the points calculation. And there's a lot of lobbying going on right now to suggest that this is a terrible idea and nobody will build any housing anymore if you do this. But it looks right now, even though we haven't got a government, that the parties that exist in Parliament, there's still people in Parliament voting on things, that laws still are being put in. And it looks like from July, this might come into place. So they extend the point system to so there's a new sector of middle-income private rental housing. And a lot of landlords will be affected by this. And just kind of reference the politics of it, these are the people who, this is a different law actually. These are the coalitions that are coming around these kind of policies because we don't have one party that's bigger than, well, we do, but the parties are kind of, their power is spread in coalitions. So Hugo de Jonge, the Minister of Housing, he's not from the he's not the same party as the Prime Minister. Another key thing that's happened in the last 6 to 12 months is the 2016 Housing Act that took away secure tenancies and rent controls. It's back in again. So if you, I think from in the next few months, if you get a new rental contract, it'll be an old-style rental contract with secure tenures. These are very powerful. And just as a personal example, I had a neighbour downstairs who was a renter. She'd been there since the 1990s. And the street where I live has gone up a lot in price. And she was offered 100,000 to leave, 100,000 euros. And she didn't. And the last I heard, that we've now moved house, she was offered 400,000 euros to leave. But she would never be able to consume so much nice housing if she bought something somewhere else for 400,000. So we're going back to that. I'm running out of time, so I won't go too much into what this means, because I want to give you, I said it, happy news, well, depending if you're a developer or a property owner or not. The kind of the latest, this is from the 19th of January, and this is a case that Amsterdam has gone crazy in terms of people splitting up small units, pushing up rents in the private sector. So we're going back. So the point system is kind of the logic of the point system, the logic of its enforcement is returning to more of what it was, I'd say, a historical norm. So what's happened is this is the Keizerkracht. It's one of the nice buildings in the Canal District in the centre of Amsterdam. And the landlord had a property, I think, with 4 apartments, and each one was rented out individually. And somebody was paying 1,900 euros a month for a 20 square metre room with a shared toilet and bathroom. And he called the local authorities and said, does this count as the point that the regulated system? So they send somebody in, they do the points calculation, they go, yes, it does. Rent should be 495 euros a month from 1,900. And then they went, but your landlord, the doors don't work and he hasn't fixed them. So until he fixes all these things, it's going down to 95 euros a month. So, exactly. So we've been in a time, this last 10 years, where it's all been about house prices doubling, about buy-to-let landlords. We've never seen this before. And it seems that, so I said we kind of have a happy ending, it seems that we're going back in a new direction. Now, I can't say if any of these things are going to work in the long run, in terms of bringing prices down, but it kind of demonstrates the capacity of this system, because these aren't necessarily transferable directly, but it's a different logic to understanding housing, and we're on a pathway that allows certain things to happen. I won't talk about, if you're really interested, I'll talk about how we tax landlords, but maybe that's best for another time. These are some articles that are kind of the basis of this lecture, should you be interested. Oh, that's that. Thank you.
Wow, thanks so much, Richard. I absolutely did not want to stop you there. What a story of, where did we begin? 1901, with the housing law which said, leave it to the market and not enough homes will be built and prices will rise. Therefore, we need to intervene. And from that starting point, Richard gave us a series of, how did you called them simple, seemingly simple things that you, meaning us in Australia, might find quite radical. Yeah. But absolutely simple and logical and straightforward. And what an amazing place to finish with the restoration of renter rights. I'm not sure if our rental commissioner, our new rental commissioner, is in the room, but I know she will find that interesting and inspiring. So, over to you. Okay, so it's going to be questions, and I'm going to go here first, and then we'll go to you, Les. So, really quick questions, and I've got 3, and let me know if you've got a question too.
I'd like to ask you, do you have an Airbnb problem in Amsterdam? And what are your views about for other cities?
Super topical.
Yes.
Oh, you want to hear the 3?
One,
no, that's good. Great idea. We'll do 3 at once.
I thought you just said 3, but...
Thanks. I know that Statistics Netherlands kept track of social cohesion. There was research where they were attempting to track the degree of integration in mental health as a result of changes in the housing market. What's been the effect of I think it started in 2008. What's been the effect on the community by these social changes?
Third.
One more.
Yeah, I was just... Our Premier in New South Wales, from what I can tell, appears to believe that if you stimulate the private supply side, that will, in the long run, medium run, I'm not sure what he expects really, reduce the cost of housing. I'm interested in the experience of the Netherlands, and also with the reintroduction of various controls, what's the response been from the private market? Yeah.
Okay.
And I won't mention tulips.
Okay, three very different ones to deal with. Airbnb is a massive problem, and I think about 4% of the housing stock up until COVID was being rented out under Airbnb. And the city formed an Airbnb task force, so you can send a WhatsApp or go to the website if you have any Airbnb issues. What they did in terms of trying to suppress it, they introduced a 60-day maximum rule for Airbnb tenancies, and that's been increased again to reduced, I should say, to 30 days, and they become quite strict on it. The problem Amsterdam has is the explosion in tourism. So it's always been a tourist city, but back in 2005, it was getting about 5 million people visiting for a day or more. Now it's 17 million. So there's a massive expansion going on in hotels. But it's very controlled. So the city really gives permits for hotel building, and it's trying to control where they're going at the same time as trying to control Airbnb. But I'd say morally as well, there's been a turn against. People see Airbnb as a terrible company, and there's a lot of resistance. If you're a homeowner, we mostly live in apartments. I mean, it's a 1910 apartment, 3 units, and I'm in an owners association, and we don't allow Airbnbs of any of the people who live in our building. So it can also be controlled at that level. Social cohesion. I'm an economic urban geographer, and I write about housing wealth. And my colleagues would be much better placed to answer that question. Social cohesion is monitored, it is a concern, and there's been a lot of lost trust in institutions in recent years. There's been a number of scandals to do with kind of bad governance, to do with how the benefit system works for parents, etc. And I think the best indicator of what's going on in the Netherlands is the fact that we just had an election in November, and the biggest party is the far-right anti-Islam party. And we've just had 80 days of trying to form a coalition government with 4 parties. And the second most far-right party's pulled out because they think the first far-right party is just too bonkers. I'm going to go back to the basics. But the last government we had, that took nearly 300 days to form. So it's a case, but there's a strong sense that we need to have this, people want it and we need to give it a try, this kind of extreme right. But it's a very different, specific kind of extreme right that we get. So Wilders, who's the leader of the party, he stole a lot of votes from the other weird far-right parties, like the ones that are into conspiracy theories, and he stood up and challenged kind of really crazy right-wing ideas. And he's been much more kind of, they've started calling him Milders, like milder. And he's been much more concessionary to other parties. So without going into too much depth about what's happening in Dutch politics, and we're waiting for this new coalition, there is diminishing community. I wouldn't say it's failed at all, but there's more concerning is a declining faith in institutions, which is the way the whole country works. There's a faith that housing associations will function in a certain way. We were just having a discussion before this meeting about statistics and data on housing. Well, the government has all your data in the Netherlands, and if we're doing research, we apply and we can get hold of everybody's data at an individual level to do analyses of things like housing affordability. So we've really relied on a lot of social trust. I mean, our taxation system, our highest tax rate is nearly 50%. We really have to trust that the government spends the money wisely. And the last question, private supply, will it solve housing? No. And it never has anywhere. It's a simple answer, but it's a good thing to believe at night and go, I wish. And I mean, Britain's probably the worst case of, because the builders, private developers, quintupled their profits in the last 25 years. The Netherlands is different in the sense that we haven't got that much space. We have this the west of the country, so the east of the country is all aging, and these cities are all declining, and all the growth is in the east, in the already very densely populated parts. But the difference is that the housing associations have always built lots of houses and have the capacity to kind of to re-engage them again. So the government's doing lots of different things that I haven't really got time to cover. Like one thing they're doing, they just allocated 200 million for kind of collective shared housing projects for social tenants. So companies can get this money and build like a collective with 40 apartments where people come together to kind of be in a community, but they're going to be social tenants. And the rents that are derived from building that will be used, put into a pot, and used to develop more collective co-housing.
Okay, have we got any further questions? Yes. Just put up your hand if you've got a question so I know. Okay.
Thanks. I'm really interested in the point system. Has anyone tried to apply it to Sydney?
You tell me.
Or is it translatable?
Is it translatable? Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, 'cause it was introduced in an era where there was incredible shortages. And so it was, and in a high-trust society, it was relatively, and social was being rolled out. So the idea, I think, for a lot of people was maybe it would go away once housing problems were solved, which never happened. What's happening, I know I set out that the new branch of it, the middle sector that's being developed, which is a different point scale. I should add to that, there's a caveat that's different, that before in the point system, the tenant had to go to the local authority and say, please come and check my house. What they're proposing is that landlords are responsible for making sure where they are in the point system, and that they will be fined if they are operating outside of that. And a lot of lobbying is going on right now, but it seems, last I heard, this law will go through in July. So who knows the Dutch politics at the moment? But it's been on the books for quite a while. This was the Hugo de Jong, Minister of Housing, big plan. And because there's a point system already, people seem to be accepting of it. And we only went so far down a route of expanding this kind of make houses a pension scheme for rich people, or for middle-income people even. Sydney? Yeah, where's your starting point? Start small, build up, and go from there.
Time, I think, for one or possibly two more questions.
Well, what's the most popular number of bedrooms, say, for instance, if you had to build 100 apartments, would you, like studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, what's most in demand?
I couldn't give any statistics off the top of my head, but most new social housing that's built is built with 2 or 3 beds. But a lot of the housing that is being produced in Amsterdam right now is 1 bedroom and studio stuff. Because half the city is 1-person households. So there's a huge demand for small units and a declining demand for family units, for family households. We have an issue that we have in terms of the demographics, the in-migration, out-migration. We tend to be a city where you move in when you're young, form a partnership, marry, produce children, and instantly move out of the city. But again, the country is so small. I mean, we don't really have, there's no kind of suburbs to Amsterdam. But if I go to Haarlem, which is a different city, that's all of 15 minutes on a train. If I go to the man-made islands we've built, Almere, it's 15 minutes on a train. So in Amsterdam, people really think that within the ring road, that's 1 million miles from outside the ring road. Because even in Randstad itself, you live in Rotterdam, you could be door to door to your job in an hour on the train. I wouldn't drive, then you wouldn't be door to door in an hour. So the matching of the development of units of a certain number of bedrooms only makes sense if you look at the interaction between cities and the suburbs. So, these basically commuter cities. So commuter cities, it's mostly private development still, and it's mostly houses, and if it's private sector, it's usually 2 to 3 bedrooms. And in the city, it's more social, and it's smaller units, and it's not really designed for, it's for starter families, if you like, or for singles.
And all of it very well connected. We've got 2 questions, and they're going to be quick.
So in your presentation, there was the government's target is 900,000 new housing.
By 2030.
Right. I'm just wondering how you can build that many housing by 2030, where like a UNICEF's government target is 130,000 in 5 years. Yeah, I just wonder like if you have enough builders and the materials like a lower, like cheaper.
In Australia, we have quite a strong private development sector. Is that the same in the Netherlands? Is it as large and strong as what it might be in Australia?
Okay. 2 interconnected questions, I think. First of all, I'd say that these targets are probably very different to what will actually happen. But it's so, I'll be back in 2030, and I'll let you know. It is an initiative where the Ministry of Housing and the central state actively try and engage local authorities. I think that's what's important about it. So it's about the central government saying, okay, we've got to do something about housing output, and there's nothing we can do centrally. Therefore, we're going to create a whole load of obligations and requirements of local authorities to build more. Because a lot of local authorities don't want to build more. They're quite happy how they are. And especially they don't want extra social housing. So there's a kind of a dialectic, a struggle between the central state and the regional governments and the local authorities. So my guess, as much as anything, would be that output increases, but I don't think they'll reach 900,000. And then the power of the lobby. Historically, not, but like nothing. But when the social housing companies became very wealthy in the late 90s, early 2000s, and became very powerful, there was a real move to consolidate power and start lobbying a lot more. And there's been a shift to kind of centre-right governments where developers have had much more say in what's going on. So I'd say there's always been the presence of the developers' lobby, and their voice became much louder in the early 2000s. And I think I might mention this before, but then there was a moment where they sent a letter to the EU government complaining about the Dutch social housing sector, saying, so the EU has no say on housing policy, but it does on competition. So they complained and said, under competition law, the Dutch social housing operators are not playing fair, and local authorities do give them special deals. And the outcome was that the central state very much used that to, in their objectives to undermine housing associations in the 2010s and onwards. So developers are quite powerful. They do, but they also do very well with making deals with local authorities. I think the real debate right now actually is the representatives of large and small-scale landlords, because they're the ones who are really being crushed. Because the government still wants to build a lot, so the developers are doing okay. But who's really suffering right now is landlords, especially people who joined recently when prices were high, with expectations of certain rent yields that they're not going to get. And so the organisation of Dutch real estate agents, and the Netherlands is full of kind of small-scale monopolies. So the app you use to find a house in the Netherlands, we've only got one, it's called Thunder, and it's owned by the Association of Real Estate Agents.
We're going to have to draw a line. I don't know whether to be absolutely depressed by the comparison with the Netherlands or inspired and optimistic that things may change. I'm going to go with the latter. Before we thank Professor Richard Ronald and before I invite you to carry on the conversation outside, and I know people will have some more questions, I need to tell you that Thursday fortnight, we're going to do it all over again. Slightly wider, bigger topic with Professor Ronald's colleague, Dr. Rowan Arundel, who's here also from University of Amsterdam, and that's going to be fantastic. We're also going to take the opportunity to launch Dr. Cameron Murray's new book, and that's going to be really, really fiery. If you've already tried to register and you've been told it's sold out, please put yourself on the wait list, because we use that to release tickets or to find another room if we need to. So please do come. We want it. We really hope to see you there. So everyone, please join me in thanking Professor Richard Ronald.